The morning had started like every other morning for the past 2 months, with a knot in Martinez's stomach that refused to untie. She'd woken at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her alarm, her mind already racing through the events of the day ahead. Today was the day, the custody hearing, the day that would supposedly determine her future, though nobody had bothered to ask what she actually wanted. Sat in the back seat of her mother's sedan, her small frame swallowed by the oversized booster seat she'd months ago but insisted she still use. Outside the window, downtown Austin blurred past, the Congress Avenue Bridge, the state capitol building, all the familiar landmarks that once meant adventure and excitement. Today they meant nothing. Her mother's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "It's going to be fine, baby," said, her voice wavering in a way that told it wouldn't be fine at all. "The judge will see that you're happy with me. He'll understand that you're father, that he's just too busy." Said nothing. She stared at her sneakers, the ones with the tiny holes near the big toe that her father had promised to replace last weekend before the lawyer said he couldn't see her without supervision. The shoes felt like a betrayal somehow, as if wearing them meant she was taking sides. The truth was far more complicated than either parent seemed to understand. Pulled into the courthouse parking garage, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead like nervous heartbeats. They rode the elevator in silence, kept checking her phone, texting her lawyer, Sandra Torres, who had assured them, for the hefty retainer fee, that the case was absolutely winnable. Winning. That word had become the refrain of this entire world lately. Everyone talked about winning, but nobody talked about what happened to the loser. In this case, suspected the loser was her. When they arrived at the courtroom on the third floor, was already there, standing outside the heavy oak doors with his own attorney, James. His heart did that familiar flip-flop thing it always did when she saw her father these days. He looked different than she remembered, older, sadder, with dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before the divorce. His construction company's tan had faded, replaced by the pallor of someone spending too much time indoors, probably worrying. His face lit up when he saw, and he started toward her, but positioned herself between them like a goalkeeper. "The custody agreement says supervised visits only," she said coldly. "No unsupervised contact until after the hearing." His jaw clenched. For a moment thought he might argue, might fight for even a brief hug. Instead, he just looked at his daughter with an intensity that made her chest ache, and he nodded slowly. He mouthed something, "I love you," and turned away. Felt something inside her fracture. At 9:15 a.m., they entered the courtroom. It was smaller than had expected, and colder. Everything was wood and marble and echoing silence. Judge sat elevated at her bench like a queen presiding over a kingdom of suffering. She had sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. Wondered if those eyes could somehow see inside her head, could read the confusion and fear and guilt she carried every single day. The bailiff instructed everyone to stand. The judge entered with a rustling of black robes. His mother squeezed her shoulder, a gesture meant to be comforting, but that felt more like a warning. "Don't mess this up," it seemed to say. "Choose me. Prove you love me more." The proceedings began with legal arguments. The attorney, a severe woman named Price with gray hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, stood and began laying out her case like a prosecutor in a criminal trial. "Your Honor, Martinez has been the primary caregiver for his entire life. She's the one who's attended every doctor's appointment, every school function, every recital. Mr. Martinez, while well-intentioned, operates a construction company that demands his complete attention. His work schedule is erratic. He frequently works weekends and often travels for projects. In the 6 months since the separation, he's missed multiple scheduled visits due to work emergencies." It was technically true, but it was also a lie. Knew her father had rescheduled those visits. He hadn't just forgotten. He'd worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep the company running while also dealing with the divorce. She wanted to shout this from the witness stand, but instead she sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, disappearing into herself. Saturni countered with his own arguments about's right to a relationship with both parents, about the importance of not allowing work schedules to be used as weapons, about the fact that many single fathers worked full-time and still managed to be present, loving parents. It all sounded very reasonable and very distant, as if they were discussing someone else's life entirely. Then came the hard part. Judge called for a recess, and when court reconvened, the focus shifted to herself. Martinez, do you understand that you're here today because the court needs to understand your best interests? Judge asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. Nodded, her throat tight. I need you to speak, honey, for the record. Yes, whispered. And then the questions began. Saturni asked about her favorite memories with her mother, the weekend trips to the children's museum, the bedtime stories, the special mother-daughter time. With each question, felt her mother's gaze boring into her, silently demanding answers that would favor her side. Then Saturni asked about her father, the times he'd helped her with homework, the bike rides they used to take, the way he used to make her laugh by doing silly voices. His eyes filled with tears as she answered these questions because these memories felt like admitting she loved him, and admitting that felt like betraying her mother. As she spoke about her father, about the things he'd done for her, his body language shifted beside her. The warmth in her mother's presence seemed to cool, and understood with the clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of crisis, that answering truthfully might cost her something precious. Her anxiety began to climb. Her hands trembled. Her breathing became shallow. The courtroom suddenly felt very small and very hot. Eyes darted toward the courtroom doors, and she desperately wished for one thing, the one being who had always made her feel safe without requiring her to choose, without demanding loyalty, without making her feel guilty for her own complicated emotions. She wished for Luna. The afternoon sun filtered through the courtroom windows in thin, accusatory rays, illuminating dust motes that floated like tiny judgments. Sat in the witness box, feeling impossibly small, as if the wooden structure was designed for adults, and she was simply a miniature version trying to fill a space meant for someone bigger, stronger, more certain. Price Saturni adjusted her glasses and smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Let me ask you about a specific incident. On March 15th, you stayed with your father for the weekend. Can you tell me what happened that evening? Stomach twisted. She knew exactly what incident was referring to. Her father had taken her to dinner at her favorite restaurant, the one with the pasta shaped like little bows. He'd been texting with someone about work, and when his phone rang, he'd stepped away to take the call. It was maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20. To a 7-year-old who'd been waiting anxiously to spend time with her father, it had felt like hours. He had to answer his phone, said quietly, her voice barely audible in the cavernous courtroom. And how did that make you feel? Pressed, leaning forward with the intensity of a predator who'd caught the scent of blood. I felt, his voice cracked, I felt like maybe he didn't want to be with me as much as his work. Behind her, she heard her mother make a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, but something in between that felt like validation. Had said the right thing. She'd chosen the right answer, and somehow that made her feel worse. Attorney James had tried to object, but Judge had overruled him. The damage was done. Had fed the narrative that her father was an irresponsible, work-obsessed parent incapable of prioritizing his daughter. What hadn't mentioned, what she didn't know how to articulate, was that she'd also noticed her father's stressed voice during that phone call. She'd heard him talking about a job site where someone had been injured. She'd understood, in the way children somehow do, that he'd been worried about a person's. But framing it that way seemed to complicate things in a way that nobody wanted complicated. The questioning continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 45 minutes. Asked about school, about grades, about whether her father had attended recent parent-teacher conferences. The answers weren't entirely in his favor. Had to admit that her father had attended most of them, and he'd actually been the one to notice she was struggling with math and had arranged for a tutor. But spun each answer, extracting just enough truth to support her narrative while discarding the context that might have painted in a more sympathetic light. By the time James got his turn to ask questions, was already emotionally depleted. She'd been on the witness stand for over an hour, and every word felt like she was walking across a tightrope suspended over an abyss. One wrong step, one answer that seemed to favor her father too much, and she worried her mother would never forgive her. James tried to ask her about happy memories with her father, about his dedication to her school and her interests, about the ways he showed up for her. But answers came out flat, defended, as if she were confessing to a crime rather than describing love. "Your father taught you to ride your bike, didn't he?" James asked gently. "Yes," said. "And you were scared of falling." "I still am," admitted. "But your father kept teaching you anyway. He stayed with you every single day for 2 weeks, catching you when you wobbled, celebrating your progress. Do you remember that?" Nodded, and suddenly, unexpectedly, tears began streaming down her face. Not the controlled tears of a child performing sadness, but real tears, the kind that came from a place of genuine anguish. She remembered. She remembered the pink bandage on her knee, the way her father's hands had felt firm and safe holding the back of the seat, the moment he'd let go and she'd ridden 10 feet by herself while he cheered like she'd won an Olympic medal. She also remembered that 2 weeks of intense father-daughter time, had seemed angry during that period, had made comments about how her father was showing off and being irresponsible by letting her fall, had absorbed that criticism and had, over time, reframed those happy memories as examples of her father's negligence rather than his love. "I remember," whispered. And James continued, but he was cut off by subjection which Judge sustained. The moment passed. By the time the court took another recess, felt hollowed out. She was escorted to a small consulting room with her mother while the attorneys conferred with the judge, pulled her into a tight embrace and felt the weight of expectation in that hug. She'd performed well. She'd said the things that supported her mother's case. She should feel proud, or at least relieved. Instead, she felt nauseated. "You did so good, sweetheart," whispered, stroking her hair. "The judge can see that you're more comfortable with me. He understands that your father is just too busy to really be your parent." Said nothing. She closed her eyes and thought about Luna, about the way the dog would rest her head on his lap without judgment, without requiring her to choose or perform or prove anything. Luna simply existed in her presence, offering unconditional acceptance. When they returned to the courtroom for the afternoon session, things escalated. Attorney called character witnesses, teacher, who that seemed anxious and withdrawn, though she carefully avoided mentioning that the anxiety had intensified after the separation and custody battle began. A family friend that she'd seen missing important moments in life. Each testimony felt like another brick, added to a wall being built between and her father. Attorney tried to counteract the narrative by presenting his own witnesses, a who about how often turned down overtime and lucrative contracts because they conflicted with his parenting time, a neighbor who'd seen taking to school most mornings despite owning a business that required early morning site visits. But the emotional damage had been done. Sat in her chair, her stuffed animal, a worn rabbit named Mr. Whiskers that had been a gift from her father, clutched against her chest so tightly that its synthetic fur was becoming matted. Judge watched the child with increasing concern. She could see what was happening. A 7-year-old girl was being systematically torn apart, forced to navigate loyalty and guilt in a system designed for adults. Hands had begun to shake. Her breathing had become shallow. She looked like she might be sick at any moment. During another recess, sat alone in the bathroom stall, hyperventilating. Her vision blurred. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just sadness or anxiety anymore. This was a child experiencing a genuine panic attack, triggered by the impossible situation in which she'd been placed. When she emerged, her mother didn't notice her distress, was too busy consulting with her attorney, too focused on winning to see that her daughter was falling apart. The afternoon session would prove to be a turning point, the moment when even the legal system would have to acknowledge that something was fundamentally broken about this entire proceeding. By 2:47 p.m., it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that was in crisis. The child sat in the witness box looking like a fragile bird that had been repeatedly thrown against glass. Her color had drained to a ghostly pale, and her breathing remained shallow and rapid. Judge had called for another 15-minute recess, but everyone knew the real problem wasn't time. It was that this little girl was being forced to participate in her own dismantling. James' attorney made a split-second decision that would change the trajectory of everything. He stood abruptly and approached the bench, requesting a private conference with the judge and opposing counsel. Price looked irritated at the interruption, but she gathered her papers and followed him. In the judge's chambers, away from view, James made his unconventional proposal. "Your Honor, I'm requesting an adjournment of the hearing until tomorrow to allow my client's daughter to be evaluated for the psychological impact of this proceeding. Furthermore, I'm requesting that we reconvene with a qualified mental health professional present to ensure the child's." Immediately erupted. "That's an obvious delay tactic," she snapped. "The child is fine. She's simply emotional because she knows her father's negligence has affected her life." "The child is not fine," James countered quietly, his voice steady and professional. "She's experiencing what appears to be acute anxiety symptoms, possibly approaching a panic attack. Continuing to question a child in this state violates basic ethical principles regarding child testimony. If we push forward and something serious happens, if she has a complete breakdown or becomes physically ill, this entire proceeding becomes legally questionable." Judge, who had been observing throughout the day with increasing concern, nodded slowly. "I have to agree with Mr. The child is clearly distressed. However, I'm not inclined to grant an adjournment. We've already been at this for hours and both parties are eager for resolution." She paused, considering. "What else are you proposing?" James took a breath. He was about to gamble on something that many judges would dismiss out of hand. "There's an alternative, Your Honor. The child has an emotional support animal, a dog named Luna. The animal is trained in therapeutic intervention. I'm requesting permission to bring the dog into the courtroom for the remainder of the proceedings. The presence of the animal has been scientifically documented to reduce anxiety in children and may allow to testify more accurately and honestly without being overwhelmed by her emotional state." The silence that followed was deafening. His face flushed red. "Absolutely not. That's emotional manipulation, pure and simple. You want to parade some cute dog in front of the judge so the child gets sympathy points. This is exactly the kind of theatrical nonsense that degrades serious legal proceedings." "It's not theatrical," James said calmly. "It's therapeutic, and it's not designed to manipulate the judge. It's designed to protect the child while allowing her to provide testimony. If anything, an emotionally regulated child is more likely to provide honest answers, which serves the interests of justice." Judge leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled thoughtfully. "Tell me more about this dog. Is it trained?" "Luna is registered as an emotional support animal with certification from a licensed animal behaviorist. She's completed a specialized training program in anxiety response and trauma intervention. The child's therapist can testify to the dog's qualifications and the therapeutic benefit." "Who is the child's therapist?" Judge asked. "Dr. James, Ph.D., a licensed child psychologist specializing in family trauma and anxiety disorders. He's available to testify if the court requires it." Stood up. "Your Honor, I must protest this in the strongest possible terms. Allowing an animal into a courtroom sets a terrible precedent. It's—" Judge held up her hand. I'm going to hear from the child's therapist. If his credentials are legitimate and his assessment is professional, I'll consider the request. But understand this. If I allow this, and if I detect any indication that the animal is being used for manipulation rather than therapeutic purposes, this entire line of questioning will be stricken from the record, and you'll face sanctions. Are we clear? Absolutely clear, Your Honor, James said, relief flooding through him. 20 minutes later, Dr. James sat in the witness box. He was a composed man in his mid-50s, with kind eyes and the measured demeanor of someone accustomed to navigating the intersection of psychology and law. He wore his credentials like armor, a PhD from 20 years of clinical experience, multiple published papers on child anxiety and trauma-informed care. Dr. James began, "Have you been treating Martinez?" "I have, for approximately 18 months. She was initially brought to me by her father for evaluation of anxiety symptoms that had emerged following her parents' separation." "Can you describe his condition?" "Presents with generalized anxiety disorder with specific manifestations related to interpersonal conflict and abandonment fears. She's experienced a significant exacerbation of symptoms since the custody dispute began. In the context of this courtroom today, she's displaying clear signs of acute distress, elevated heart rate, rapid shallow breathing, potential dissociation. Continuing to question her in this state without appropriate intervention could result in a complete anxiety episode." Cross-examination was aggressive. "Isn't it true that you have a financial interest in this case, doctor? You're being paid by Mr. Martinez, are you not?" "I am, as is typical in therapeutic relationships. However, my professional obligation is not to any particular outcome in this case. In fact, if I believed that testifying would harm her interests, I wouldn't be here." "And this emotional support animal, you're not a veterinarian or animal behaviorist, are you?" "No, but I've collaborated with certified animal behaviorists in treatment. Luna completed a 200-hour specialized training program in deep pressure therapy and anxiety response. The research supporting animal-assisted therapy in child psychology is extensive and peer-reviewed. But isn't it also true that such animals can be disruptive in a courtroom setting? Luna is trained to remain calm and focused in high-stress environments. Her presence has been shown to reduce cortisol levels, stress hormones, in children within minutes of interaction. In this case, having Luna present would allow her nervous system to regulate, which would enable more accurate testimony." Judge asked several questions of her own, and doctor answered each with professional precision. By the time he stepped down from the witness stand, the judge had clearly been impressed. "Mr. Judge said, I'm going to grant your request, however with strict conditions. 1. The animal remains under the handler's complete control at all times. 2. If I observe any indication that the presence is being manipulated for theatrical effect, it leaves immediately. 3. We proceed with the understanding that the animal's presence does not diminish the seriousness or validity of this proceeding. Are we understood?" "Thank you, Your Honor," James said, barely containing his relief. Stood to object, but Judge was already dismissing court for 30 minutes to allow for the dog's arrival and acclimation. What happened next was nothing short of remarkable. When Luna padded through the courtroom doors 40 minutes later, her handler, a young woman named who specialized in therapy animal work, kept her on a short leash. Luna was a beautiful golden retriever, approximately 5 years old, with an intelligent gaze and a calm demeanor that seemed almost human in its perceptiveness. The moment saw Luna, the transformation was instantaneous. The child's entire body relaxed. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing deepened. She watched as Luna approached and sat directly beside her chair and then reached down and placed her hand on the dog's head. Judge observed this with a clinical eye. She could see the physiological change in the child. Still looked anxious, still looked sad, but she was no longer in acute crisis. She was present and grounded. Whispered something to her associate, clearly unhappy with this development, but she said nothing aloud. As court reconvened, Judge noticed something else. With Luna's presence, seemed more willing to speak. Her answers came more fluidly. She still showed signs of distress when difficult questions were asked, but she didn't shut down. She didn't hyperventilate. The dog was doing exactly what Doctor had predicted. But neither attorney anticipated what would happen next, a moment so significant that it would alter the entire trajectory of the case. Judge reconvened court at 3:45 p.m., and the atmosphere in the room had shifted subtly. The presence of Luna seemed to have changed the dynamic, not by invalidating the legal proceedings, but by acknowledging that at the center of this case was a child who needed protection, not just a custody puzzle to be solved. James resumed his questioning. He was gentle, allowing time to formulate her thoughts. With Luna's solid presence beside her, seemed to find reserves of courage she hadn't possessed during the morning session. "I want to ask you about something important," James said. "When you're with your father, what kinds of things do you do together?" Paused. Her hand remained on Luna's head, stroking the soft golden fur in a rhythmic, calming motion. "We do homework. He helps me with math because I used to be really bad at it, and he reads to me. He does funny voices." A small smile flickered across her face, the first genuine smile anyone had seen all day. "He reads the voices of all the characters different, and sometimes he makes them sound silly on purpose to make me laugh." "That sounds lovely," James said. "Does your father ever talk to you about your feelings?" "Yes." His voice grew quieter. "Especially when I'm scared or worried. He listens to everything I tell him, even if it's about something small." Couldn't resist interrupting. "Your Honor, I'm going to need to redirect the witness's attention. These are leading questions designed to elicit favorable characterizations of the father." Judge held up a hand. "I'll allow it. The witness is a child, not a hostile party. Some guidance is appropriate." But was shaking her head, making notes, clearly preparing her own line of questioning, designed to undermine whatever positive character traits were being described. Then came the pivotal moment. James was asking about anxiety, about whether her father was aware of her struggles. "Has your father talked to you about your worry feelings?" Nodded. "He said I'm not broken. He said my brain just processes things differently, and that's okay. He said lots of people have worry brains, and that we can learn to be friends with the worry instead of fighting it." "That sounds like wise advice," James said gently. "Did your father help you learn to be friends with the worry?" This was when everything changed. His face shifted. A complex expression moved across her features, something between vulnerability and determination. She looked down at Luna, and then, with deliberate precision, she made a specific hand gesture. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was a practiced movement, her hand positioned at a particular angle, fingers configured in a specific way, the motion executed with the kind of repetition that comes from training. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. In immediate response to this gesture, Luna repositioned herself. The dog moved her front paws slightly forward and placed her head directly on his lap with deliberate pressure. Then, in a movement that appeared choreographed, Luna shifted her entire weight slightly forward, draping her front legs more heavily across the child's legs while keeping her head firmly pressed against his stomach. It was deep pressure therapy in its textbook form. Judge's eyes widened. She leaned forward, her judicial composure momentarily cracking. She was watching something that went far beyond a child simply being comforted by her dog. She was watching a trained behavioral response, the kind of response that requires professional instruction, repetition, and practice. Noticed the judge's reaction and began leafing frantically through her notes, clearly trying to understand what she just witnessed. His breathing, which had been relatively shallow, deepened noticeably. Her body relaxed further. The anxiety that had been visible in her shoulders and jaw seemed to drain away. She remained silent for a moment, simply stroking Luna's head while the dog provided this precise, calibrated pressure against her small frame. When finally spoke, her voice was steadier. "Dad helped me learn it," she said quietly. "He and the trainer person. We practiced it a lot." "Practiced what?" James asked carefully, though he sensed he was witnessing something significant. "This. Luna does this when I feel scared or the worry gets too big. It makes my body feel less scared. It makes my heart stop going so fast." She paused. "Dad said it's like my body is learning that it's safe, that the worry can't actually hurt me." Judge's expression had transformed. She was no longer merely watching, she was analyzing, processing, making connections. Her sharp eyes moved from Luna to the handlers and back again. Seized the moment to object. "Your Honor, I'm going to request that we strike this line of questioning. This is clearly the result of coaching. The child is being prompted to provide testimony that's been scripted in advance." "I haven't prompted her," James said calmly. "The gesture came from the witness entirely unprompted in response to my question about whether her father helped her learn to manage her anxiety." "It's a trained response," argued, her voice rising, "which means it's been deliberately engineered by the opposing party to create sympathy." But Judge held up her hand, silencing further argument. "Let's take a short recess," she said, her tone brooking no discussion. "Bailiff, I need to see both attorneys in chambers, now." As everyone filed out of the courtroom, Judge's eyes never left and Luna. She was seeing something that the attorneys had missed, or perhaps something they'd been deliberately prevented from seeing by the narrow focus of their legal strategies. In chambers, Judge didn't waste time on pleasantries. "That gesture the child made, that's trained, that's practiced. I want to know everything about it. Where did it come from? Who taught it? When did this training begin?" James explained about the animal behaviorist, about the specialized training in anxiety response, about the deliberate practice sessions that had been incorporated into therapy. He explained it calmly and thoroughly, laying out the timeline and the certifications. Argued that this was evidence of manipulation, that had deliberately trained both the child and the dog to perform this response specifically for the courtroom. But Judge was shaking her head. "That's not what this is. You don't train a 7-year-old child and an animal for 18 months just to perform once in a courtroom. That takes consistent, dedicated effort. And more importantly," Judge leaned back, her mind clearly working through implications, "this suggests something that neither of you have really examined. The question of who has been actually invested in this child's mental health." And she looked directly at James. "I'm going to need documentation. I want to see the therapy records. I want to see the animal training documentation. I want to know the timeline of when these interventions began, who initiated them, and what progress has been made. And I want it before we proceed any further." "Your Honor, I can have those documents here within an hour," James said. "Do it," Judge commanded. "This hearing is adjourned until 5:00 p.m. As the attorneys filed out, Judge sat alone in her chambers, thinking about what she'd witnessed. A child making a gesture that revealed not manipulation, but something far more profound. A parent's desperate attempt to help his daughter heal, even at a distance, even while fighting for the right to be in her life. When court reconvened at 5:00 p.m., the documents had been delivered. Judge reviewed them with meticulous care. She saw the dates, had enrolled in therapy 18 months ago, just weeks after the separation. He'd pursued the animal therapy approach 9 months ago. Every receipt, every therapist's note, every trainer certification told a story that was radically different from the narrative that had dominated the courtroom all day. The story of a father who hadn't been absent at all. The story of a man who had chosen his daughter's mental health over every other consideration, including his own peace of mind during a contentious divorce. The story of someone who had invested not just money, but time, research, dedication, and love into helping his child survive a family crisis. And it was all written in that one simple gesture, a gesture that revealed everything the lawyers had missed and everything the judge needed to know. Judge sat alone in her chambers at 4:15 p.m., surrounded by documents that told a story far more compelling than the one being presented in her courtroom. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk as she meticulously reviewed each page, each receipt, each therapist's note with the precision of a detective solving a crime. What she was discovering was that the crime wasn't one of parental neglect. It was one of narrative manipulation. The carefully constructed story that Price had been building throughout the day was crumbling under the weight of documentary evidence. Judge began with Dr. James' clinical notes, and yes, it was ironic that the therapist and judge shared the same last name, though they were no relation. The first entry was dated 18 months ago, just 3 weeks after and separation was finalized. The notation read, "Patient presents with acute anxiety symptoms, including difficulty sleeping, persistent worry about family stability, and manifestations of separation anxiety. Father reports that child has expressed distress about the dissolution of the family unit. Patient is highly attached to family dog, Luna. Recommend incorporating animal-assisted therapy into treatment plan." Judge made a note to herself. 3 weeks after separation, not 2 years of parental neglect but immediate, proactive intervention by the father. She continued reading. There were entries describing progress, some sessions where she'd regressed, others where she'd made breakthroughs. There were detailed notes about involvement. Father attended today's session, demonstrated significant investment in understanding daughter's anxiety responses. Father has been reading literature on childhood anxiety and has implemented suggested coping strategies at home. Father reports practicing breathing exercises with child 3 times weekly. Notes positive changes in child's sleep patterns and reported decrease in worry symptoms. Another entry, 6 months into treatment. Father inquired about animal therapy options specifically, has done extensive research and located certified animal behaviorists specializing in deep pressure therapy. Father willing to invest significant resources, discussed feasibility and potential benefits, recommended proceeding with specialized training. Judge set down that page and removed her glasses, rubbing her eyes. She was beginning to see what James had been trying to show her all along, a picture of paternal devotion that went far beyond the minimum required by law or custody agreements. She picked up the next document, a formal assessment from certified animal behaviorist Wellington, dated 13 months ago. This was the key document, the one that explained Luna's training and the methodology behind gesture. The assessment was professionally written, filled with technical terminology, but ultimately clear in its conclusions. Luna had been selected specifically for her temperament and her natural inclination toward empathetic response. The training program was customized to address particular anxiety profile. Deep pressure therapy, the very response Judge had witnessed in the courtroom, was a scientifically validated intervention for anxiety disorders, PTSD, and autism spectrum disorders in children. The document detailed the protocol. Luna would be taught to recognize specific hand signals and verbal commands that indicated was in distress. Upon receiving these signals, Luna would perform a specific sequence of behaviors designed to provide grounding through pressure and contact. The training had involved multiple sessions with both Luna and learning to work together as a therapeutic team. What struck Judge most forcefully was a handwritten note at the bottom of the formal assessment. Mr. Martinez has demonstrated exceptional commitment to this process. He has attended every single training session, taken detailed notes, and has worked with his daughter to practice the protocols in his home. His financial investment in this program, $3,200, is substantial, but more notably, his time commitment, averaging 8–10 hours per week for the past 3 months, demonstrates genuine prioritization of his daughters. This level of parental involvement significantly increases the likelihood of successful therapeutic outcomes. Judge leaned back in her chair, 8 to 10 hours per week, while running a construction company, while dealing with a contentious divorce, while working to maintain his relationship with his daughter under supervised conditions. She picked up the next stack of documents, receipts and invoices. A therapy invoice from doctor for 18 sessions over the past 18 months, $150 per session, totaling $2,700, all paid by within 5 days of receipt. An invoice from the animal behaviorist for the training program, $3,200. Additional invoices for ongoing monthly training sessions with Luna, $400 per month. Judge did the math. Over 18 months, had invested approximately $6,900 in mental health care, not including his own time and emotional labor. More tellingly, these expenses had been incurred during a period when he was also paying for his own attorney, maintaining 2 separate households, and dealing with the financial stress of a business that undoubtedly suffered from his divided attention. But the documents that truly shifted Judge's understanding were the therapy appointment logs, not just the appointments with doctor, but the sessions had attended. The logs showed that had missed only 2 appointments in 18 months, once due to a genuine work emergency involving a job site accident, and once when he was hospitalized with appendicitis. In both cases, he'd rescheduled within days. Then there were the notes from therapy sessions, specifically documenting his participation. Session 12, father attended, discussed own anxiety regarding custody proceedings. Father expressed concern that his work commitments might be misconstrued as disinterest. Father expressed worry about losing custody and its potential impact on his recovery. Discussed how parental anxiety can transfer to child. Recommended mindfulness practice and cognitive reframing. Father demonstrated excellent insight and commitment to managing his own emotions for daughter's benefit. Judge felt a shift in her chest. This wasn't a man trying to manipulate a courtroom. This was a man working desperately to heal his daughter while simultaneously managing his own fears about losing her. She reached for the final document, a letter from doctor dated 2 weeks ago, clearly written in anticipation of today's hearing. It was marked professional opinion for court consideration and was addressed to Judge herself. Your Honor, it began, I am writing to provide clinical context regarding the custody matter involving Mr. Martinez and his daughter. As treating psychologist, I have observed firsthand the significant and ongoing commitment that Mr. Martinez has demonstrated to his daughter's emotional and mental health recovery. When first presented to my office 18 months ago, she was displaying symptoms consistent with generalized anxiety disorder exacerbated by family trauma. The prognosis at that time was uncertain. However, I have witnessed remarkable progress in symptomatology, which I attribute directly to the intensive, consistent, and loving involvement of her father. Specifically, I want to emphasize that Mr. Martinez did not simply maintain custody arrangements. He actively participated in his daughter's healing. He attended therapy sessions, implemented clinical recommendations, invested significant personal and financial resources, and demonstrated the kind of sustained commitment that is required for meaningful therapeutic change. I must also note that in my professional experience, children thrive when they maintain meaningful relationships with both parents. Progress has been contingent upon feeling secure in her relationship with her father. Any custody arrangement that significantly limited her access to Mr. Martinez would likely result in regression of her clinical gains. Furthermore, the very gesture that demonstrated in your courtroom today, the hand signal that prompted Luna's deep pressure therapy response, is itself evidence of Mr. Martinez's dedication. This gesture was not trained into by a parent seeking theatrical advantage. Rather, it was carefully taught as a genuine coping skill by a father and a trained behaviorist working toward the child's long-term mental health. In my professional opinion, Martinez represents an exemplary example of a parent prioritizing his child's above all other considerations, including his own convenience or peace of mind. The letter was signed by Dr. James, Ph.D., with his credentials and professional license number clearly displayed. Judge set the letter down slowly. She sat in silence for a long moment, allowing the implications to fully settle. She had been on the bench for 19 years. She had presided over hundreds of custody cases. She had seen genuine parental neglect, abuse, and indifference. But she had also seen cases where narratives were carefully constructed to obscure the truth. This was one of those cases. The timeline, the receipts, the therapist notes, the training documentation, they all pointed to a single inescapable conclusion. Martinez had not been an absent father. He had been a present, dedicated, loving father who had faced impossible circumstances and had responded with grace and commitment. Judge picked up her phone and called her bailiff. "I need you to do something for me," she said. "I need you to pull the attendance records for the parent-teacher conferences at school for the past 18 months. I need to know which parent attended each conference and when. I also need you to pull any documentation the school has regarding parental involvement, volunteer hours, field trip participation, communication records, everything." "Yes, Your Honor," the bailiff replied. "When do you need this?" "Before we reconvene at 5:00 p.m., Judge said firmly. She hung up and made another call, this time to her clerk. "I need you to pull all discovery documents that were filed in this case. I'm looking specifically for any communications between the parents, any emails, text messages, anything that shows the pattern of interaction between Mr. and Mrs. Martinez over the past 18 months. I particularly want anything relating to therapy or medical care." As she waited for the documents, Judge made detailed notes. She was building her own narrative, not one constructed for dramatic effect or for the benefit of either attorney, but one grounded in documented fact. By 4:55 p.m., the additional documents had arrived. The school attendance records showed that had attended 12 of 18 parent-teacher conferences. The 6 he'd missed were due to documented work emergencies or scheduling conflicts that he'd communicated to the school in advance. In each case, he'd requested written summaries of the conferences to review at home. The school volunteer log showed that had participated in classroom activities on 4 occasions, had attended every school assembly, and had volunteered for the field trip to the Science Museum. And then there were the emails. Judge selected a random sampling and began reading. An email from 8 months ago. "Hi, therapist mentioned she's been having trouble with math fractions. I'd like to hire a tutor. Would you be open to splitting the cost? I found someone excellent who specializes in making abstract concepts concrete for kids. Let me know." Response: "That's fine, whatever you think is best." Another email from 6 months ago. "I've arranged the dog training that doctor recommended. It starts next month. It's going to cost about $3,000, but I believe it will help significantly. I wanted to let you know in case you wanted to be involved or had concerns." His response was curt: "Fine, that's your choice." But here was the revealing part. Had included despite having no legal obligation to do so. He had sought her input. He had kept her informed. Judge found one more email that crystallized everything. It was dated just 2 weeks ago, shortly after the custody hearing had been officially scheduled. Had written to, "I know we've had our differences, but I want to know that we both love her. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure she feels secure in this process. I'm continuing her therapy and I'm going to keep working with her on her coping strategies. I hope you'll do the same. Whatever happens with the custody arrangement needs both of us to prioritize her. That's the only thing that matters." His response, "Agreed, comes first." Judge read those final words 3 times. Both parents had stated they would prioritize, but only one of them had actually demonstrated it through consistent, documented action over 18 months. At 4:58 p.m., Judge stood and looked out her window at downtown Austin. She thought about the 7-year-old girl in her courtroom, about the way she'd made that gesture, about the story that gesture had told. A story of a father who hadn't missed a thing. A father who had been present in all the ways that mattered most, even when the custody arrangement had tried to keep him at a distance. Judge knew what she had to do. When Judge reconvened court at 5:00 p.m. sharp, the atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted, though most of the participants didn't yet understand why. Judge's expression was unreadable, the face of a judge who had seen something troubling beneath the surface and was prepared to dig deeper. "Before we proceed," Judge announced, "I'm going to need to request additional evidence that wasn't explicitly presented in this hearing. Mr. I'd like you to provide detailed documentation regarding all mental health interventions and therapeutic services that have been provided to the minor Martinez. I need receipts, invoices, attendance logs, and clinical notes, everything. I'm particularly interested in understanding the timeline and who initiated each intervention." Price immediately stood. "Your Honor, if I may object, this is highly irregular. We've already presented our cases. Additional evidence at this stage is within my discretion as the presiding judge," Judge interrupted calmly but firmly. "And frankly, Ms. Price, what I observed in this courtroom this afternoon suggests that both parties may not have been entirely forthcoming about the circumstances relevant to this child's. So I'm going to examine the facts more thoroughly before issuing a ruling that will affect this child's future." James moved efficiently, having anticipated this request. He'd maintained copies of all relevant documents and had them organized in a clear chronological file. Within minutes, he was presenting them to the judge and providing copies to opposing counsel. What happened next was almost theatrical in its revelation, a slow, methodical unraveling of the narrative that had dominated the entire day. Judge began reading aloud, speaking in a measured, deliberate voice that seemed to echo through the courtroom with particular weight. "I see here documentation that 18 months ago, specifically 3 weeks following the separation, Mr. Martinez enrolled his daughter in therapy with Dr. James. The initial diagnosis was generalized anxiety disorder, with trauma-related components stemming from the family dissolution. The recommendation at that time was animal-assisted therapy." She looked up from the document. "Ms. Price, in your opening statement, you characterized Mr. Martinez as an absent father too consumed with work to attend to his daughter's emotional needs. Yet the evidence suggests that within 3 weeks of his separation, he recognized his daughter was suffering and sought professional intervention. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Had gone pale. "Your Honor, seeking therapy doesn't necessarily indicate." "Please allow me to continue," Judge said, not unkindly. She returned to the documents. "I see further evidence that 9 months ago, Mr. Martinez located and hired a certified animal behaviorist to provide specialized training to the family dog, Luna. The cost of this training was $3,200. The purpose was to teach the animal to respond to specific signals from his daughter, signals that would indicate anxiety and trigger therapeutic responses designed to regulate the child's nervous system." Judge paused, letting that sink in. This training program required Mr. Martinez to attend sessions regularly. According to this attendance log, he attended 37 of 39 scheduled training sessions over a 9-month period. He missed 2 due to documented emergencies. She looked directly at. "This is the attendance record of a man who was too busy working to be present in his daughter's life." Attempted to speak, but Judge held up her hand. "I'm not finished." She shuffled through more papers. "I see here correspondence with doctor indicating that Mr. Martinez not only attended his daughter's therapy sessions but actively participated in them, taking notes, asking questions, implementing clinical recommendations. Doctors' notes describe Mr. Martinez as exceptionally committed and note that his presence and participation were directly responsible for clinical improvement. The courtroom had gone utterly silent. Even the ambient sounds seemed to have stilled. Furthermore, Judge continued, I have here payment records showing that Mr. Martinez has paid for 18 months of therapy, 18 sessions total, at $150 per session. He has paid for the animal training program at $3,200. He has paid for 4 months of ongoing monthly training sessions at $400 per month. In total, Mr. Martinez has invested $6,900 in his daughter's mental health care over the past 18 months. Judge set down that document and picked up another. And I have here school attendance records showing that Mr. Martinez attended 12 of 18 parent-teacher conferences. The 6 he missed were due to documented work emergencies, after which he requested written summaries of the meetings. I also have volunteer logs showing that Mr. Martinez participated in school activities on 4 occasions and attended every school assembly. His face had taken on a grayish pallor. She was beginning to understand what was happening. Her carefully constructed narrative was being systematically dismantled by documentary evidence. Most significantly, Judge said, her voice taking on an almost contemplative quality, I have here email correspondence between Mr. and Mrs. Martinez. In these emails, Mr. Martinez has kept the mother informed of all therapeutic interventions. He has requested her input. He has explained his reasoning. And in each instance, Mrs. Martinez has responded with agreement or indifference, never offering to share the financial burden, never offering to participate in the therapeutic process. Judge looked directly at Mrs. Martinez. According to your testimony today, you characterized yourself as the primary caregiver and implied that your ex-husband's work commitments prevented him from being an involved parent. Yet the evidence suggests that while you maintained day-to-day care responsibilities, you were not involved in addressing your daughter's mental health crisis. Is that accurate? Looked like she wanted to disappear. She didn't respond directly. Instead, she said quietly, I didn't think the therapy was necessary. I thought she would get over it. You thought she would get over generalized anxiety disorder, Judge repeated, her tone making it clear how inadequate that response was. Meanwhile, Mr. Martinez was investing thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours to help her actually heal. That's a meaningful distinction. Judge turned her attention back to the documents. I want to address something specific that occurred in this courtroom today. At approximately 3:45 p.m., when Martinez was experiencing visible distress, her emotional support dog, Luna, was brought into the proceeding. At that point, the child made a specific hand gesture, a gesture that prompted Luna to perform a precise therapeutic response known as deep pressure therapy. She looked at James. Ms. Price characterized this as manipulation. She suggested that Mr. Martinez had coached his daughter to perform this action for courtroom sympathy. I'd like you to explain the actual timeline and significance of this gesture. James stood. Your Honor, that gesture is the result of 9 months of collaborative training between Luna and a certified animal behaviorist. It's a genuine coping skill that has been taught and practiced repeatedly. According to the behaviorist assessment, such training requires consistent practice and repetition. It's not something that could be taught specifically for courtroom purposes. Rather, it's a therapeutic tool that uses regularly whenever her anxiety becomes overwhelming. Exactly, Judge said. And the fact that she was able to employ this tool in my courtroom today is itself evidence of the genuine therapeutic progress she's made. Progress that is directly attributable to her father's dedication. She turned to look at who sat silently stroking Luna's head. Young lady, that gesture you made, that was a real tool your father helped you learn to use, correct? Nodded, her voice small but clear. Yes, Your Honor, we practiced it a lot. Dad said it was like giving my body permission to feel safe. Judge's expression softened, though her voice remained judicial. And you practiced this with your father, not with your mother. Yes, said. Dad practiced with me most days when I was at his house, and he helped me practice at the trainer's office too. Judge made a note, then looked back at the assembled parties. What I have here is documentary evidence of a father who did not abandon his child during a difficult period. Rather, he actively researched her condition, engaged qualified professionals, invested substantial personal and financial resources, and demonstrated consistent commitment to her healing. What I do not have is evidence that supports Ms. Price's characterization of Mr. Martinez as an absent, work-focused parent. Attempted once more to object, but Judge silenced her with a look. In fact, Judge continued, what I have is evidence that suggests something quite different. I have evidence that Mr. Martinez recognized his daughter was suffering and responded with the kind of dedication and commitment that is, frankly, uncommon. He did this not for courtroom performance. He did this not to gain custody advantage. He did this because he is her father and he loves her. The judge set down all the documents and removed her glasses, rubbing her eyes. When she looked up again, her gaze was penetrating. Mrs. Martinez, I want to ask you directly, were you aware of the extent of your ex-husband's involvement in therapy? Hesitated, clearly weighing her words. Not the full extent, no. And did you ever encourage or support his efforts to help your daughter? I didn't think it was necessary, said quietly. I thought she just needed time and her mother's comfort. Time and comfort are important, Judge acknowledged, but they are not a substitute for professional intervention when a child is suffering from a genuine anxiety disorder. Mr. Martinez understood that. You did not. She turned to look at Mr. Martinez. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. When you made the decision to invest in all of this therapy, this training, this intervention, was your primary motivation to gain advantage in a custody hearing? His voice when he spoke was thick with emotion. No, Your Honor, my only motivation was to help my daughter. She was suffering. I couldn't stand seeing her in pain. I would have done this regardless of whether there was ever a custody hearing. I did this because I'm her father and I couldn't not do it. Judge nodded slowly. She looked back at the stack of documents and then at Luna. What I'm seeing here, she said quietly, is a father who has been chronically underestimated, and what I'm seeing is a mother who has been well-intentioned but ineffective. And what I'm seeing is a child who has benefited tremendously from her father's unwavering commitment to her. She set her glasses back on her nose. We're going to take a brief recess while I review additional documentation and formulate my ruling. When we reconvene, I'll issue my decision. But let me be clear about something. This case is not about which parent is more perfect or more dedicated in every area of parenting. This case is about which arrangement best serves the interests of this child. And the evidence I've reviewed today suggests that best interests are served by a custody arrangement that honors the significant role her father has played in her recovery. As the bailiff called for a recess, Judge Watched continue to stroke Luna's head, watching the child's anxiety visibly decrease in the presence of the therapeutic tool her father had helped her obtain. The truth had been hidden not in dramatic courtroom statements, but in receipts, therapy notes, training logs, and a father's quiet, persistent love. The courtroom seemed smaller when everyone reconvened at 6:15 p.m. The late afternoon sun had turned golden, casting long amber streaks across the wooden benches and the judge's elevated bench. The fluorescent overhead lights had been supplemented by natural light, creating an almost ethereal quality to the space, as if the entire room knew that something significant was about to occur. Judge emerged from her chambers with a thick folder containing all the evidence she'd reviewed. Her expression was solemn but not unkind. She settled into her chair and arranged the documents before her with meticulous care. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone stood. "Please be seated," Judge said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. She looked directly at First, and for a moment her judicial demeanor softened slightly. "I want you to understand that everything I'm about to say, I'm saying because I care very much about your and your future. Does that make sense?" Nodded, her hand still resting on Luna's head. "Good," Judge said. She turned her attention to the assembled attorneys. "I have reviewed extensive documentation provided by both parties, as well as additional evidence uncovered during my examination of this case. I want to make clear that this ruling is based not on emotional appeal or theatrical presentation, but on documentary evidence, professional assessment, and the demonstrated commitment of both parents to this child's." She opened the folder. "Let me begin by addressing what I have observed and what the evidence demonstrates. First, it is clear that Martinez is a child of considerable emotional sensitivity who has experienced significant anxiety stemming from her family's dissolution. This is not a character flaw in the child. This is a normal response to an abnormal situation." Judge paused, allowing that statement to settle. "Second, it is clear that shortly after the family separation, Mr. Martinez recognized his daughter's distress and took action. Specifically, he enrolled her in professional mental health treatment within 3 weeks of the separation. This action was proactive, not reactive. It was motivated by concern for his daughters, not by legal strategy." She shuffled through the papers. "Third, Mr. Martinez continued to invest in his daughter's mental health care for 18 months, spending approximately $6,900 in financial resources while maintaining consistent involvement in her therapy process. He attended 37 of 39 scheduled training sessions for the Animal-Assisted Therapy program. He participated actively in his daughter's mental health treatment rather than simply paying for it and stepping back." Judge looked directly at Mr. Martinez. "I want to acknowledge something. What you have done for your daughter during this difficult period demonstrates the kind of parental commitment that is, frankly, remarkable. You did not use your work schedule as an excuse for absence. You did not expect your ex-wife to manage your child's mental health crisis alone. You identified a problem, and you addressed it with dedication and resources, even while managing the stress of a contentious divorce." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. He nodded, unable to speak. "However," Judge continued, turning to address, "I also want to acknowledge Mrs. Martinez. You have been the primary caregiver for this child. You have maintained the day-to-day structure and routine that children require. You have provided love and comfort during a difficult transition. These things matter. They are not insignificant." Sat rigidly, her expression pained. "What concerns me," Judge said, her tone shifting to something more measured and serious, "is that while Mr. Martinez was taking action to address his daughter's mental health crisis, you were not. In fact, according to the evidence, when Mr. Martinez suggested professional intervention, you initially resisted. You believed would get over it with time. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of childhood anxiety disorder, and it is a misunderstanding that delayed your daughter's recovery." Judge set down her papers. "Mrs. Martinez, I want to be very clear. I'm not ruling against you because I believe you are a bad mother. I am addressing this issue because in custody decisions, what matters most is not which parent loves the child more. Both of you clearly love. What matters is which arrangement best serves the child's psychological and emotional. And on that question, the evidence is unambiguous." She picked up her written ruling. "Now, regarding the custody arrangement. Effective immediately, Mr. Martinez is granted expanded custody of Martinez. Specifically, the parties will transition from the current supervised visitation arrangement to an alternating weekly custody schedule. Will spend 1 week with her father, followed by 1 week with her mother, continuing on a bi-weekly rotation." Price's face flushed. She started to stand, but Judge held up her hand before she could speak. "Additionally," Judge continued, "Mr. Martinez is granted full custody during all school holiday breaks, including spring break, winter break, and summer vacation beginning June 1st through August 31st each year. Mr. Martinez is also granted additional visitation rights on all major holidays, including but not limited to Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and his daughter's birthday. The judge paused, letting the magnitude of the ruling sink in. This was not a typical custody arrangement. It was substantially more favorable to the father than what was initially at stake. Furthermore, Judge said, I am directing that both parties continue family therapy with Dr. James. Specifically, Mrs. Martinez, you are required to participate in a minimum of 12 therapy sessions designed to address your understanding of your daughter's anxiety disorder and to develop strategies for supporting her continued mental health recovery. This is not optional. This is a court mandate. Saturni leaned over and began whispering urgently in her ear, but seemed not to hear. Her eyes were fixed on her lap. I'm also mandating that both parents participate in 4 joint sessions, with doctor focused on co-parenting strategies and communication. The purpose of these sessions is to ensure that experiences consistency and support from both parents, rather than having her therapy work undermined by parental conflict. Judge looked at again. Young lady, what your father did, what he's still doing, is something special. He recognized that you were hurting, and he found ways to help you heal. I want you to know that your father's love and commitment to you is something to be proud of. And your mother loves you too, even though she didn't initially understand what you needed. I hope that as you get older, you'll understand that people can love you and still make mistakes. His eyes filled with tears, but they seemed to be tears of relief rather than distress. Judge continued, addressing the entire courtroom. I want to make a statement for the record that addresses the broader implications of this case. Too often in custody proceedings, we focus on schedules and logistics and lose sight of the actual of the child at the center of the dispute. In this case, we came dangerously close to allowing a narrative of convenience to override the documentary evidence of genuine parental commitment. She looked at Price. Ms. Price, your strategy today was to paint a picture of a father too absorbed in work to be present in his daughter's life. You presented a narrative that fit the legal framework you were working within. However, you did not adequately investigate the actual facts. A more thorough examination of the evidence would have revealed that your client's characterization was fundamentally at odds with reality. I encourage you to reflect on how a case might have been resolved differently if the opposing party had been given less of an opportunity to control the narrative. Looked like she wanted to argue, but she remained silent. Mr. Judge said, turning to James, you did your job well. You recognized that this case wasn't about legal arguments, it was about evidence. You pursued that evidence relentlessly, and as a result, this child will have a custody arrangement that serves her actual interests. Judge gathered her documents. This ruling is final and will be entered into the court record. A formal custody order will be prepared and distributed to both parties within 5 business days. Both parents are required to comply fully with all mandates, including the therapy requirements. She looked one final time at. I know this has been a very difficult day for you, but I want you to know that what happened in this courtroom today was ultimately about making sure you get the care and support you need and deserve. Your father fought for that, and now you're going to get it. As Judge stood to exit the courtroom, something remarkable happened. Stood as well, and before anyone could stop her, she walked toward her father, caught her as she ran into his arms, and he held her as if he would never let go. Tears streamed down his face, tears of vindication, of relief, of overwhelming emotion at finally having his love and commitment recognized. Sat frozen in her chair, watching. The reality of what had just occurred was settling over her like a heavy blanket. Her custody had been substantially reduced. Her parenting decisions had been questioned in open court. And most painfully, she could see in her daughter's reaction that had known all along who had truly been there for her during the crisis. Luna remained at side, observing the scene with the calm wisdom of an animal who understood her role in a family's healing. She leaned against S's leg, providing that steady, grounding pressure even as the child embraced her father. The courtroom had cleared of all but a few people. The judge had left, the bailiff was gathering documents, and the attorneys were conferring quietly. But in this quiet aftermath of the verdict, something profound was happening. A family was being rebalanced. A child's voice had finally been heard through the evidence of her father's love, and justice, in its most meaningful form, had been served. Held his daughter and looked toward James, nodding with gratitude. The attorney returned the nod, understanding the significance of what they'd accomplished together, not a legal victory, but a vindication of truth and a safeguarding of a child's. As they left the courtroom, with Luna walking beside them, reached up and held her father's hand. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe freely. The choice that had been forced upon her in that courtroom, the choice between two parents, had been replaced with something far better: the security of having both parents in her life, arranged in a way that finally, truly, prioritized her above all else. 6 months had passed since Judge's ruling echoed through the Austin courtroom. 6 months of transformation, healing, and the slow reconstruction of a family that had been fractured by divorce, but was now being carefully, deliberately rebuilt. Martinez stood at the entrance to Riverside Elementary School, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a genuine smile on her face. It was a Thursday morning in late April, and she was about to attend the school's spring assembly, an event that, a year ago, would have filled her with paralyzing anxiety. Her hands wouldn't have trembled. Her stomach wouldn't have churned with worry. Her mind wouldn't have raced with catastrophic thoughts about saying the wrong thing or disappointing someone. But today, she felt only anticipation. "Ready?" asked, standing beside her with a thermos of coffee in one hand and his lunchbox in the other. He looked better than he had in years. The dark circles under his eyes had faded. The stress lines around his mouth had softened. He'd gained back the weight he'd lost during the divorce proceedings. He'd started sleeping through the night again. "Ready?" confirmed. She reached down to scratch Luna behind the ears. The golden retriever had become a fixture in life at both homes. She spent alternate weeks in his apartment and his house, serving as a living bridge between the two households. "Can Luna come to lunch with me today?" Smiled. That was the plan. Remember, Mrs. Harrison said Luna could visit the classroom this afternoon for the pet therapy presentation. His face lit up. Her third-grade class had been learning about emotional support animals, and Mrs. Harrison had invited various community members to bring their animals for an educational presentation. Luna would be the star of the show, a real, certified therapy dog who could demonstrate the difference between regular pets and animals trained for specific therapeutic purposes. As they walked into the school together, reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The custody arrangement had taken some adjustment. The alternating weekly schedule meant that was constantly transitioning between 2 homes, 2 routines, 2 versions of her life. But what Judge had understood, what the evidence had shown, was that this arrangement actually provided with more stability than the previous setup, because it meant both parents were equally invested in her and equally present in her daily life. The financial pressure on had eased considerably. He'd stopped taking on the high-stress, high-paying projects that had required him to work weekends and travel. His business was smaller now, but it was more sustainable. More importantly, it allowed him to be fully present during his weeks with no rushed goodbyes, no missed bedtimes, no divided attention. Had initially resisted the therapy mandate, viewing it as punitive. But over the course of the mandated 12 sessions with Dr. James, something had shifted in her understanding. She'd come to recognize that her response to his anxiety, her belief that the child would simply get over it with time and motherly comfort, had been rooted in her own anxiety about parenting, not in a genuine assessment of her daughter's needs. Doctor had helped her understand something profound. Loving a child doesn't mean protecting them from all difficult experiences or all professional intervention. Sometimes loving a child means recognizing that they need help that goes beyond what a parent can provide alone. Sometimes it means stepping back and allowing others, therapists, behaviorists, other parents, to contribute to the child's healing. By the third month of therapy, had begun attending some of therapy sessions, not to undermine work, but to genuinely participate in her daughter's recovery. She'd learned the breathing exercises. She'd studied the research on childhood anxiety. She'd even started accompanying to some of Luna's training sessions, so she could understand the therapeutic protocols and reinforce them at home. The transformation had been gradual but genuine. She was no longer the mother who believed her daughter should simply get over anxiety. She was becoming the mother who recognized her daughter's needs and responded with support and understanding. At school, Mrs. Harrison spotted and waved enthusiastically. "Perfect timing. We're just about to start the assembly, and you brought Luna." "She's going to do a presentation during the afternoon session," said, her voice confident and clear. "She's going to show everyone how she does deep pressure therapy." "How wonderful," Mrs. Harrison said. She glanced at with obvious warmth. "It's so nice to see you this morning, Mr. Martinez. Been talking all week about you attending the assembly." "I wouldn't miss it," said. He gave a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. "I'll see you at pickup time. Have a great day." As left the school, he reflected on how much his relationship with his teachers had improved. When the custody situation had been uncertain, he'd felt like he was constantly on trial, as if his presence in school life was being evaluated and judged. Now, the teachers clearly recognized him as an equal partner in education. They called him with updates. They invited him to conferences. They acknowledged his involvement in her academic progress. The custody arrangement had changed something fundamental. It had legitimized his presence in his daughter's life in a way that the previous supervised visitation arrangement never had. At his office downtown, his business partner, Carlos, was managing the morning's projects, had made significant changes to his work life since the custody ruling. He transitioned from a hands-on construction manager to a more strategic role. He still worked, still earned a good living, but he deliberately scaled back his hours and his commitments. "How was drop-off?" Carlos asked. "Good, excited about Luna's presentation at school today. Picking her up after school, and then I get her back next Thursday." "How's handling the new arrangement?" Carlos asked carefully. He knew the answer was complicated. "Better than I expected," admitted. "She's doing the therapy. She's learning. It's not perfect, but it's better. We're actually starting to be able to talk about without it turning into a conflict. That's progress." That afternoon, Luna's presentation at Riverside Elementary became something of a sensation. Stood proudly beside the dog as Mrs. Harrison explained the concept of emotional support animals and therapy training. Luna demonstrated the specific behaviors she'd been trained to perform, the hand signal recognition that gave, followed by the precise deep pressure therapy response. The children in the class were fascinated. One little boy raised his hand and asked, "Can Luna teach me how to do that? Because sometimes I get really scared, and I think I would feel better if Luna did that to me." Mrs. Harrison gently explained that Luna was trained specifically for, but that if the boy wanted to learn about anxiety management, he could talk to his parents or teacher about getting help. It was a beautiful moment, a child recognizing that his own emotions might benefit from professional support, inspired by seeing another child's healing in action. Glowed with pride. Her dog wasn't just a pet, she was a teacher, a healer, a living example of what was possible when a family prioritized mental health and emotional. By evening was back with. The transition between homes, which had been fraught with tension and anxiety in the early months, had become routine. Knew that she would see her father next Thursday. She knew that both parents loved her. She knew that both households were safe and stable and genuinely invested in her. Had prepared's favorite dinner, pasta with the little bow-shaped noodles. As they ate, asked about the assembly and the presentation, described it enthusiastically, and listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions and celebrating her daughter's pride in Luna's performance. "Your dad must be so proud," said, and the tone wasn't resentful anymore. It was genuine. "He is," agreed, "and he said you should be proud too because you're helping me get better too." His eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears. "I am proud of you, sweetie. I'm proud of how brave you've been through all of this." That night, as tucked into bed, something shifted in their relationship. Wasn't trying to be the better parent or the parent who could solve all of his problems. She was simply being a mother, present, supportive, loving in the way that could actually be. Across town, sat at his small desk in his apartment, looking at the framed photograph that now held the place of honor, himself and Luna all smiling. He thought about the custody hearing, about the moment Judge had recognized something that the lawyers and the contentious legal process had nearly obscured: the simple truth that a father's love could be measured in small actions, consistent choices, and unwavering commitment. He thought about the rubric of modern parenting, which often measured success in proximity and possession. Who has custody, who has more time, who has the child most of the week. But Judge had measured success differently. She'd measured it in outcomes. She'd measured it in evidence of genuine commitment. She'd measured it in a child's. Over the following months, the effects of the ruling rippled outward in ways that no one had anticipated. Judge began referencing the Martinez case in her judicial continuing education presentations. She wrote an article for a legal journal about the importance of examining documentary evidence in custody cases rather than relying solely on testimony and narrative. The case became something of a landmark, cited by other judges navigating similar custody disputes, referenced in law schools as an example of how thorough fact-finding could lead to justice that actually served a child's interests. But the broader legal implications were far less important than the simple fact that her world had become stable. By the following school year, her teacher reported significant improvements in her classroom performance. She was raising her hand more often. She was forming friendships more easily. She was no longer having panic attacks in academic settings. Doctor noted in his final clinical summary, patient has achieved substantial remission of anxiety symptoms. While patient continues to experience occasional situational anxiety, she now possesses functional coping skills and has experienced sufficient family stability to support ongoing psychological health. Recommend continued monitoring, but anticipate that patient will no longer require intensive therapeutic intervention. It was time to discharge from active therapy, a victory that meant she had genuinely healed. A year and a half after the custody hearing, took to the courthouse. He wanted to show her the courtroom where the hearing had taken place to help her understand the significance of what had happened there. "This is where Judge helped fix things," explained gently. "This is where you got to spend more time with me," said. Her understanding of the proceedings filtered through the perspective of a child who had simply wanted both parents to be present and happy. "Yes," agreed. "But more than that, this is where the truth came out. This is where your anxiety and your feelings and the things I was doing to help you, all of that became more important than the stories people were telling about me." Looked at the judge's bench, trying to imagine Judge sitting there, looking at the evidence, making the decision that would change everything. "Dad," said, "I'm glad you didn't give up. I'm glad you kept trying to help me even when it was hard." Knelt down and pulled his daughter into his arms. "I would never give up on you, never." As they left the courthouse, with Luna walking beside them, reflected on the full circle that their family had traveled. The separation that had seemed like an ending had become a beginning, a catalyst for healing, growth, and a more authentic understanding of what family could be. The custody ruling had given what she actually needed, not a choice between two parents but access to both. Not a winner and a loser, but two parents working together toward a common goal. not a settlement of a legal dispute, but the reconstruction of a family based on honesty, evidence, and genuine commitment to a child's. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Retry can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.